Professor Graeme Samuel AC is one of Australia's most respected figures in public policy, regulation and governance. As Professor at Monash University Business School, he led the independent review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, or EPBC Act, which provides the blueprint for long-awaited reform. The EPBC Act, originally enacted in 2000, set the framework for protecting Australia's biodiversity and culturally significant sites. And Professor Samuel's work directly informed the new environmental legislation passed in November 2025 under the Albanese government. A former chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, he's also served in prominent leadership roles across community and business, including President of Dementia Australia, Chairman of the Victorian Taxi Services Commission, and board positions with Opera Australia, Melbourne and Olympic Parks Trust, the Melbourne Cricket Ground Trust, Airlines for Australia and New Zealand, and Quebec's Proprietary Limited, to mention just a few. He was also an inaugural commissioner of the Australian Football League. Graeme's community service spans leadership in sporting and cultural organisations and national policy forums, recognised with his appointment as a Companion of the Order of Australia for eminent service to public administration and the community. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Graeme Samuel. Today's going to take the form of a fireside chat. We don't have a fire here, Graeme, but we're certainly going to find a bit of information about Graeme's journey with the Act that I just mentioned and also other elements of his public life too. So I guess to kick things off, Graeme, you've led reviews and reforms across many sectors during your career. What persuaded you to take on the review of Australia's environmental laws, knowing it was likely to be one of the most contested policy debates in the country?
I was asked, and so it was like a challenge. But you went into it contested. When then the Environment Minister certainly asked me to do it, I said, well, two things. Why me? And so I said, I know nothing about the environment. She said, because you do know how to do a review, and I want you to come completely without any preconceptions or biases or prejudices at all, clean sheet of paper. I said, well, that's fine, that's good. And then I turned to her and I said, you know, this will be so contested, there will be strong advocates both for and against environmental protection, biodiversity conservation. I said, I can confidently predict that the only people at my funeral will be my family and those that want to see me dead and buried. She said, yes, but it will be the largest funeral ever seen in Australia.
So I guess when you started though, like what surprised you most about what you found?
Well, the beginning was that I asked the department to give me a compilation of all the laws and regulations. They were that high. And I started to read them. Okay, what a job that was. But I found out that about 90% of it was process, so little of it was outcome. So it was all about you file this application, file that application, etc., etc. The other thing that was replete throughout the documents, throughout the legislation regulations, was the weasel words. That is, substantial, significant, where appropriate, where possible, you know, all this stuff that was the let-outs. And was it any wonder that, oh, and by the way, ministerial discretion was replete also throughout. So was it any wonder that, you know, any time an applicant made an approach for a proposal for development, whatever it is, they just said put the application in, and then they shot off to the minister and they said, we think that this is insignificant on its impact on the environment, we think it is immaterial, and we do not think it's appropriate, etc. And so the minister had a conga line of applicants outside his or her office, you know, really there to push the issue. On top of all that, you had certain states, particularly Queensland and WA, who were much more focused on receiving royalties from mining in particular than they were on protecting the environment. And one of the big battles we had was to deal with two groups. One was West Australian government in particular, and that involved the West Australian Chamber of Mines. And I remember when the review ultimately came out, in a Senate hearing, the CEO of the West Australian Chamber of Mines turned around and he said in the Senate hearing, If Samuel's recommendations are adopted, there'll be no new mining ventures in WA forever. And I repeated this in a forum that I was attending, and I said, well, this is the greatest load of utter self-serving nonsense you've ever heard. The CEO rang me and he said, Graeme, that's outrageous, it's defamatory. I said, mate, calm down, just read your Hansard. And I said, then you'll know exactly what you said. I quoted you verbatim, it's the last I heard from you. So you do have these extremes all over the place, Adrian, and it's a major battle.
So I guess touching on that, dealing with sort of mining interests, dealing with state governments. So the reviews that you conducted sort of included here from governments, from industry, but also traditional owners, from scientists, environmental groups, and many of them have fundamentally different views. So what was the most challenging part of them trying to bring those different views together?
The challenge was actually not as big as you think, because what happened was the review started in October 31, 2019. 30th of June 2020, I had submitted a draft interim report to government. And that interim report was published on the 21st of July of that year. And then what I did was I drew together 21 significant interest groups from the Business Council of Australia, the Chamber of Mines, the farmers, scientists, the academics, the conservationists, Conservation Foundation, the Environmental Defenders Office, etc. There's 21 of them, they're all listed there. I sat them down around a table and said, righto, here's the deal, guys. If you insist on 100% of your aspirations, you will get nothing, I can guarantee it. If you insist on only 80% of your aspirations, I think we can get there. But remember this, the report will be mine, it'll be my view, it won't be yours, but I'll take account of what you have to put to me, but don't go for 100% because you won't get it. Now, interestingly, around the table they sat and listened, they said, right, we agree. Right around the table they agreed. I'll tell you a bit later on what happened after the report was published, and Scott Morrison intervened to say that the report's not going to be implemented, but we'll come to that in a moment.
So I guess that's maybe leading to this point. So I guess, was there a moment during the review that you faced that, well, this is a pretty big mountain to climb, and the scale of challenges Australia is facing was maybe too high?
No, never. Look, I've done many reviews for government, in the not-for-profit sector in my life, and nothing's ever been too hard. I was talking to Michelle Grattan this morning for a podcast, and we were talking about the Chalmers tax reform package. I said, look, the essence of reform is to analyse thoroughly what you're doing, be totally committed, be dedicated, be determined, and above all, have courage and communication. Courage is important because you will get turned off by the vested interest, and communication is important because you've got to actually be able to explain what's about. That's what makes tax so hard to reform, because it's a highly complex issue, and it is very difficult to reform tax because of the complexity. We've seen it in the past 3 or 4 weeks, and I'll lay my colours right out on the table. I think that what Chalmers and Albanese have done with the budget is admirable and miraculous, and for those of you that think that it's going to be the end of small business, it's going to be the end of the economy, it's going to be the end of the world, just take it calm, guys, because that's not the case. We had this when the wandering off. When we did the GST reform, Robert Gerald of the Council of Social Services and myself as chair of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry decided we get together. I might say there were a couple of people around the table of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry that said, what the hell are you doing talking to the Council of Social Service? And I said, listen, a tax reform proposal from business alone will never get there. It's got to be a public interest, something focused on the public generally. So we promoted the GST. Now, for those that can remember back to then, inflation was going to run rampant and was going to kill the economy. Small business will be destroyed. It actually didn't happen, right? But here were esteemed economists that actually were out there saying inflation will run rampant and small business will be destroyed because the obligation to do the business activities taken to pass. Hasn't happened. Right? So what I said on the environment reform was these things will work. The beauty of the environment reforms is this: is first of all, wiped away the process, item one. Secondly, said, right, the important thing is the outcomes. And the outcomes have got to provide certainty to business, that is to proponents, and certainty to regulators, and reduce the role of the minister as far as possible, because you don't want that conga line of activists that are there to, pray at his door and apply all the pressures. And so that's what we did. The important thing was built into the reforms and in the legislation now. It's what I call a self-help mechanism. And we devised this again when Peter Tesh and I, his former ambassador to Moscow, did the review of the Defence Trade Controls Act. You think something's hard. It doesn't start focusing on export of sensitive military material outside Australia. But so we did that, and I said, self-help is this. Under the law as it used to be, I've got a proposal to mine, flick it into the department, let them sort it out. Hopeless. So now, what will happen under the law as it now stands is that you've got the law, you've got environmental standards, which you formulate at the moment. I can come back to those in a second, they're really important. Then the third thing is you'll have guidelines issued by the Department and the Minister as to how those rules, those environmental standards are to be interpreted. Then on top of that, you will have rulings issued by the Department or the Minister or the Environment Protection Authority, which will show how they've interpreted the standards in given cases. A bit like the Australian Tax Office tax rulings, right? You've got that whole compendium, and then the final thing is, if the government actually wants to do this, is it will select a cohort of independent advisors that are there to go through your proposal and to say, yeah, tick, 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 oops, hold on, I've got a problem with that one, better come back, let's send it to your address, tick, 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 right? And you do it all, and then a proponent says, well, golly, barring that one issue I've got to deal with, it looks like I've got it covered, it's all done, right? And so that's the beauty of what we've done. It's certainty, it's self-help, it's all those processes are all there. And I think it's the certainty that businesses wanted in the past, on top of which, and this final thing, I'm sorry, I've got so much to tell you about a 450-page report, but the really important thing is this. Under the law as it then stood, when you had an application for a proposal, development or a mining proposal, you had to go to both the Commonwealth and the state. And the Commonwealth would do its assessment and the state would do its assessment. Now the Commonwealth managed to devolve or to accredit states to do the assessments, but they were never really well done. They were, if you went to WA, the assessment was pretty easy. How do you think Duke and Gorge blow up occurred if you really followed strict principles as to how to deal with Indigenous culture and the like? And 46,000 years of Indigenous culture blown up because the West Australian government gave the green light to Rio to actually do just that. So there's all that's now covered. And what we said was there ought to be a single touch. What the Commonwealth ought to do is to be able to say to each and every state, tell you what, for the benefit of business, you can be the sole assessor and the sole grantor of approvals or rejections, right? But, this is the important but, if you're going to have that accreditation, you've got to undertake and satisfy a continual watching process to make sure you're complying with the rules. The moment you don't comply with the rules, the application will be called in from you and taken to the Commonwealth, and you will lose your accreditation. So that's a discipline. And the Gather group I talked about before, the 21, couldn't quite get their minds around that. And I said, look, you don't trust the Commonwealth, you don't trust the states, we've got to trust someone. So we'll put it into the rules, the environmental standards, and they will be inflexible, and then it will be incumbent on the Federal Minister, because it will be reported in Parliament, that if a state hasn't complied with the rules, they lose their accreditation, business will go to berserk because they now we've got to go through a two-tier, two-pronged sort of approach to deal with it. The final thing, Adrian, and then I will shut up for a minute, is this. The environmental standards are now coming out. So we've got the law in place. That was absolutely miraculous. November 28, 2025, the Senate had gone through a whole day of, you cannot imagine the processes they went through. I actually spoke to Tony Burke afterwards and said, mate, I'll tell you what the next review I'd like to do is of parliamentary processes. He said, Graeme, he said, you're not getting anywhere near them, he said, because you're making them efficient. And as Carl can stand, Elbow and I are the only two that understand what they are, so I said, get things out of it. But, so the law was passed, and as they did the final vote, I stood up. I still get moved by this, but I turned to my colleagues in the department who were sitting behind me and I said, great, great thing, guys. Thanks so much. And I choked up because it was 5 years after the report, which took 12 months to get there. But the environmental standards are the rules. They're very, very important. And the main environmental standard is called the Material National Environmental or Matters of National Environmental Significance. That's been published for a second time. And what I strongly advocate to the Minister is that there are too many expressions like where appropriate, where possible. I've said delete them. You don't want all that. Make it absolute. Or if you have to do something that's a bit of a rider, then that the proponent should use their best endeavours. Now, for those of us that are lawyers, I was one half a century ago, best endeavours means you've got to bend over bloody backwards, really, really try hard, you've got to do everything you possibly can. It's almost an absolute standard. And I'm hoping government takes that up because that'll stop those kind of line of activists that are lining up outside his door.
Thanks very much for that.
What was the question?
Well, I guess based on what you were saying, though, like the review took 5 years. It started with the government of one political party, ended with the government of another political party. Throughout that, you had states changing government as well. No doubt there were also changes to appointees within government departments of who was running what. How did that work? And I guess what sort of barriers did that create and changes to the process?
Adrian, it didn't worry me in the slightest. Look, I'm not political. I was many, many decades ago. I'm not political, and governments are both persuaded and understand that. And I'll call it as I said, and I think it ought to be. So when the legislation was going through the Senate, I was up in Canberra that day in Parliament House, and the work I've around there, I was up there, and I got calls from Sky News and ABC, you've no idea, all to come to interview. So I thought, well, bugger, I'm going to actually tell them what I think. So I said, I thought that the coalition's behaviour on this was shameful, that it was a disgrace, the approach that they were adopting, that they commissioned this review. I know the Minister supported it, and I've never revealed how I do know, but I do know, and I've got it in my files at home. And I said, she congratulated me on the review. I said, it just simply is disgraceful that they're now opposing it for the wrong reasons. I then went out, by the way, and congratulated Sarah Hanson-Young of the Greens, because she sat down with Murray Watt and reached a deal to pass the legislation. And the Minister showed me the summation of what she agreed to. And I sat there and I said, tick, 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 double tick, 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 double tick. I said, absolutely brilliant. And I saw her afterwards, we had a gathering in Murray Watt's office, and I said to Sarah, I said, thank you so much. I said, you showed common sense, objectivity, and a desire to actually get something done for the environment. And I said, it's not for me. I said, I'll be long dead before this happens. It's for the people that were standing up here before. It's our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, future generations. And at long last, we've got, through the admirable work of Murray Watt, the support of Sarah Hanson-Young, we've now got an outstanding piece of law to work with. I must say that the next day I went into Parliament for the House of Representatives discussion on it, and Albo got up and he pointedly turned to Susan Lee, who was Leader of the Opposition, and he said, you commissioned Samuel to do this review, you got the review, you embraced it, why are you now opposing it? And that was politics. In the political scene, Sarah Hanson-Young was great to work with. The problem was the Nats. And I sat with Matt Canavan, you talk about various political persuasions. I sat with Matt Canavan during the course of the review. I just let that discussion sit to my colleagues with me. I said, well, that was an hour of time that's wasted, and at my age, you know, you really relish those that you can't get back.
That's right. You touched on, I guess, the younger generation, and often the debate within sort of the environment, it's a competition between environmental protection and economic development, and that they're competing objectives. After everything that you've seen, do we have that debate wrong?
No, yes, we have, and it's not a competition. The competition is put out there by big business that say, you know, you can't have the environment protected and also economic growth. That's nonsense. And the objective of this review was to actually strike the balance between the two. And you strike the balance by saying the environment has to be protected. By the way, the environment is not climate change. The environment is leadbeater possums, it's orange-bellied parrots, it's grasses, it's trees, it's all those things. But I said we can do that by having a proper market-based mechanism where you can have economic growth as well as protecting the environment. Now, let me give one example. I've got an in-law who lives in Adelaide, but she's got a massive farm over near Bordertown, tens of thousands of acres. And she was saying to me, "Oh, what does all this mean, Graeme?" She said, "I can't destroy any trees anymore to make room for grazing of cattle." I said to her, "Murray, I said, think about this, you've now got a choice. You can leave the trees there and have slightly less land to graze your cattle, but the trees have got a value because they protect a particular threatened species, and that's worth something on the biodiversity market. Or alternatively, you can destroy the trees and have more land for grazing cattle. Work out the equation as to what's more value." And she looked and I gave her some figures. She said, "I'm better to leave the trees there." Precisely. And we did this with water rights. We created in the National Competition Council water rights in the Murray-Darling Basin. And in Leeton, New South Wales, they grow rice, use a massive amount of water. And I used to say to the people representing the rice growers cooperative there, to grow your rice, you will get $300 per gigalitre of water. But you can sell that gigalitre of water up or downstream to horticulturalists for $3,000 a gigalitre. Doesn't it make sense not to grow rice there, but to actually sell the water rights up or downstream? Same principle. They didn't get it.
So I guess future generations look back at this period, Graeme. What do you think, or what do you hope they'll say that we got right?
I'm hoping that what to do is that they'll look back on November 28, 2025 and say, thank you. Thank you to the Parliament of Australia for passing these laws and for getting the environment protection, biodiversity conservation right at long last. Interestingly, and look, I will bet the bottom dollar, which I don't have actually because I don't ever carry money anymore to like Visa cards, but I'll bet the bottom dollar the same thing is going to happen with the Charter tax reforms. That within about 6 months, they'll be under something else, the business will be out there, it's in all the best interest to be under something else. So have you noticed that although these laws were passed on November the 28th, and there's a big hullabaloo about it's the end of the world, it's all vanished, they're onto something else. So they're now onto Coles and Woolworths, or they're onto cost of living, or the 0.25% that's gone up in interest rates, or now it's the tax reforms. I was saying to Adrian before, and I don't know how many of you remember single-digit interest rates in this country. I can go back to when I bought my first home, which is, this will age me, 55 years ago plus, and I paid then interest to Language Building Society of 9%, and I never saw single-digit again until more recent years. We're now talking 4% plus for interest rates. And I'm saying to myself, it's because the current generation has been feather-bedded into interest rates of 3% or thereabouts, and then suddenly the media goes hysterical and lifts because the RBA lifts interest rates by 0.25% or 0.5%. Oh my gosh, if only I had 4% or 4.5% interest rates back then, how much better and easier would it be for me? But this is what happens. And the media run these lines, and if I had time, I'd get off my chest what's going on with the tax reform and certain outlets in the media at the moment, the Australian Financial Review, to mention this too.
Well, like you were telling me as well, you had a big birthday over the weekend. So I guess you've spent a lifetime to date leading difficult reforms across so many different areas. Been involved in that is building consensus amongst people who don't always agree and usually disagree. So I guess to conclude, what's the most important lesson you've learned about how to create lasting change?
Listen, but form your own view as to what's right, having taken account of all the views of all the interested parties, but you've got to listen, but don't let them dictate what you think is right. Now, I hope I don't suffer from after-interest to say that everything that I've recommended or done has been right, but it's generally tended to prove to be the right course of action. So listen, take account of the various issues, importantly take account of the political imperatives. I remember meeting with the Environment Department, there were 300 or 400 of them, and I said, guys, let me tell you, this will be my review. I said, it'll be my views. But you've got to understand that whatever you do in political life, you're going to, it's like decision tree 101. You will get to a particular point and you'll say, oops, hold on, that's going to hit a massive political brick wall. You don't stop, you work out your way around it and how to deal with it so that your minister can say, never thought of that, that's great, thank you very much, and that lets you, proceed on the process. So you do all of that, and then the next one is communication. You've got to be able to communicate. It's one of the problems that Chalmers is running up against at the moment, is that he's got a highly complex tax reform package, and it's very difficult to communicate tax reform to anyone, which is why it's always been so difficult. I did a speech recently when I was awarded a doctorate at Monash, and the theme of the speech was about leadership and achieving change. And I started off by saying I like the C word, which took a few of them back. And I said the C word is communication, is commitment, it's courage, it's collaboration, it's consensus, it's all those things, but consensus should not allow you to move away from the fundamental objective, which is to act in the public interest. And I'll finish off just by giving you a very quick anecdote of a discussion I had with Sir Selwyn McCowan, the late Governor General, just before I took on the ACCC, and I had it was a big challenge, the ACCC, and he said to me, Graeme, his process was to let you answer the question rather than to provide an answer. He said, do you feel the need to be liked? And what do you want to be your legacy? And I thought for a few seconds, and I said, Sir Selwyn, you cannot feel the need to be liked if you're going to act in the public interest. And secondly, I want my legacy to be one of a reputation for impeccable intellectual and personal integrity, to have been relevant in the public interest, no more and no less. That was the message I gave to the graduates at Monash. And I think if we can learn those lessons, then it seems to me, I'm sorry, this is hubris on my part, but it does seem to me that they're the fundamental lessons of how you bring about good for the public. And I was so impressed to hear the awardees today, all focusing on just that.
Well, Graeme, thank you for your unbelievably inspiring address through that conversation. Thank you to Adrian for orchestrating the conversation. Before you both rush off the stage, I'd like to present on our behalf a little gift.
It's the wooden box, I think.
Well, it was probably worth the wooden box, but unfortunately it's a bottle of Yarra Yering, or Yering Hill wine, but also the most important thing, which is part of our heritage, is a pair of socks. Manufactured in Australia, 200% Australian made, by Wilderness Wear, led by Philip Endersby, our past president. So I'll bring this over and wish you well. Thank you, Graeme. It was a phenomenal conversation.